Thank you all for coming along. We had no idea how many people were going to come to this, but this is fantastic. So this is To Infinity and Beyond, exploring the outer edges, fringes of science and fiction. My name is Richard Watson. I have a rather bizarre job title. I'm futurist in residence at the Tech Foresight practice, and you're allowed to laugh when I say that. And I'm interested in emerging science and technology and what's around the corner and over the horizon. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves briefly, and then we're going to kick off with the discussion. The discussion is going to last roughly 30 minutes, and then we're going to have 10 minutes of audience Q&A, and then we're going to remove from here very sharpish because there's another session at 5. So if we can start with Dave, could you... Do you need this?
Oh, I think I'm mic'd up. Yes, that's... Can you hear me at the back? Good. Am I too loud for the people in the front? Because I get that from some of my students. So, I tell them to move to the back. I am here in a double identity. By day, I am mild-mannered senior lecturer Dave Clements from the physics department, where I lecture in astrophysics and do research in that. But by night, and usually it is at night, I also write science fiction. And you can get my first collection of short stories called Disturbed Universes up at the back after we finished here, and I will be very happy to deface the book for you in whichever manner you desire.
Thank you. Pat.
I'm Pat Cadigan, and I'm Pat Cadigan all the time. It's all crazy all the time. I'm a science fiction writer. I've written several novels, none of which I've brought with me, but you know, you can get all of them just about anywhere you want to. And I won the Arthur C. Clarke Award twice. In fact, I had 2 before that. Upstart Mieville even had 1. And that's all I do.
I'm Julie McCann. I'm a professor in the Department of Computing, and I'm just a professor in the Department of Computing, nothing more exciting than that. But what I'm interested in is teeny tiny computers that are low power and low cost, and how they come together and form colonies of machines to do things that are useful to us.
I'm Roberto Trotta. I'm a lecturer in astrophysics here at Imperial and an STFC Public Engagement Fellow. And one of the things that I'm interested in my research is dark matter, dark energy. So those are all the kind of things that you find in speculative ideas about what our universe is made of and parallel universes. So is there anything else out there? And so that's sort of my angle to the science fiction. In other words, trying to research the kind of things that some science fiction writers actually put in their stories. And I might say that I've written 60 short stories, science fiction short stories. Those would be my scientific papers. Maybe there's some science fiction in them, more than I'd like to admit. But also written a short book called The Edge of the Sky, which tries to explain everything I know and all the things that I don't know about the universe using only the most common 1,000 words in English. And turns out the universe is not one of them.
Okay, well, about a year ago, I spent an hour trying to work out what the word future meant with another writer. Why don't we kick off with something that's a little bit similar? You know, what is science fiction? What do we mean? And when is something not science fiction?
Oof. Well, you primed me for this, and I've been groping for answers ever since. I think it was Heinlein, and Pat will probably correct me if I'm wrong on this,
Don't worry.
who said, I know it when I see it. And there is an aspect of that. There are some things that I will see and will interpret as being science fiction, which maybe other people would not. In some cases, the writer who's responsible for writing it, like Margaret Atwood with The Handmaid's Tale, would claim that wasn't science fiction, but I would claim that it was science fiction. She's now agreed that she is a science fiction writer, by the way. But another definition that I rather like as well, by somebody who has studied the history of science fiction in quite a lot of detail, Brian Aldiss, he encapsulates science fiction in the definition hubris, sorry, get my right teeth in, hubris squashed by nemesis. And there is a lot of that in science fiction at one level or another.
Pat, how would you respond to that?
Well, for me, science fiction has always been a thought experiment. It's always been what if. And for me, I qualified it for myself as having some basis in some science. Now, science is iffy sometimes, and science moves on. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Is that science fiction still? Or is that now science fantasy? So I don't worry too much about the exact definition. And there was a time when the genre was not as stratified as it is now. And if you ever have the good fortune to look up Judith Merrill's Best of the Year Science Fiction, you'll find that she drew from just about every kind of fantastic literature. She took classic hard science fiction that you'd find in Analog, cheek by jowl with a rather whimsical tale by John Cheever about how the dinosaurs died out. They got bored at cocktail parties and they just went extinct. I know you thought it was something more complicated. There you go. Occam's razor strikes again. And with three-liners by Tuli Kupferberg of the Fugs. So to me, science fiction is anything that makes your horizon broader and makes your mind work just a little better and a little harder, so that you kind of get excited about what you're reading and it stimulates your own ideas.
Okay, that's a lovely answer. Can we move to Roberto and Julie first, perhaps? Talking about getting excited, what's happening in science right now that maybe some of these people aren't too aware of, that you think is going to be sort of fertile ground for science fiction writers in the future? What's really exciting you on the sort of the cusp of science?
Well, for me, what I find interesting about science right now is that the silos, all the different, the physicists, the engineers, blah, 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 are no longer staying in their silos. And as a result of that is that we're getting to look at these more complex systems from different angles. We're taking into account even people who are not in the sciences and so on as well. And we're starting to bring forth much more interesting ideas. So there's more input now into the science that I find that's much more exciting. So some of the work, for example, that I'm playing with is trying to understand why the physical world is making a muck of the kinds of computing systems, even making a muck of your mobile phones, why that's happening. So I'm having now to learn a lot of physics that I didn't need to know before. And likewise, a lot of physics people are coming in and looking at how we play with computer systems to overcome those physical problems. So this mix-up, I think, is very exciting. I can see a whole new next 10 years of science that was probably hitherto unpredictable before.
Roberto, what gives you a cheeky grin in science at the moment?
Well, to me, I think in terms of expanding our horizons and giving us stimuli that go beyond what we've known in the past, in astrophysics, exoplanets, planets going around other stars, are the talk of the town, and rightly so. And it's hard to overemphasize how much of a paradigm shift. The fact is that we now know that about 50% of the stars in the universe have got planets going around them. For thousands of years, we've known only 4 planets around our own star. Then for about 150 years, we've known about 8 or 9, depending whether you count Pluto in or out. And now we know that planets are everywhere. And so we are now moving on to the next stage, which is characterizing them, studying them, understanding the properties, their atmosphere, and of course, looking for life. And so all of this, the premise of many science fiction story is that, we can travel to other planets and we can go there by warp drive or black holes or wormholes or whatever. But first you have to have a place to go to, and what kind of place is it? And this sparkles all sorts of interesting ideas. Well, now we're on the cusp of actually finding out, and that can be but exciting, because we're not going to find out that there are places out there that are stranger than anything in science fiction, I think.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to the exam question, which is what's been in science fiction over, I don't know, the last 100 years or so that's possibly about to come true for real? And this is at anybody.
Oh, I have a great one on this, because it actually goes to the heart of the question I think you originally asked for us to think about for this panel, which is how science and science fiction interact. What I'm about to discuss, it goes back to some of the first results that came back from the Voyager missions to Jupiter, and the result that Jupiter's moon Europa likely has its surface is solid ice, but it's likely to have about 100 kilometer deep ocean of liquid water underneath 20 or 30 kilometers, maybe more, of solid ice. And the same thing was found for Saturn's moon, Enceladus, by the Cassini spacecraft and Voyager when Voyager 1 and 2 went past Saturn. Now, that very rapidly got picked up by Arthur C. Clarke. And in the novel 2010, the sequel to 2001, and the movie as well, it is revealed there's some kind of life existing in the liquid water ocean underneath the icy surface of Europa. And the monolith machines do something to Jupiter and to Enceladus to speed the development of life on there. That's at the end of the book. And if you remember how the computer's final message to humanity at the end of 2010 is, all these worlds are yours, meaning all the planets and moons of the solar system. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing. Now, we've gone from science, Voyager, to science fiction, how and the life on Europa. Now go back to science. Cassini found plumes of water vapor squirting out from Enceladus. So the actual content of the liquid water ocean underneath the surface of Enceladus is emerging. It's being squirted out. It's forming the E-ring of Saturn and resurfacing Enceladus. This was work that was actually done in the Blackett lab by Professor Michelle Doherty here at Imperial College. Was one of the first people to make that discovery. If the water's coming out, so will other things that are in that water. And as a result of a somewhat drunken conversation I had with colleagues, other astronomers, in a bar in Hilo, in the big island of Hawaii, some years ago, I got interested. My normal day job is in extragalactic astronomy, looking at things halfway and more across the universe. But the same techniques we use to look at molecules in star-forming galaxies halfway across the universe can be used to look at the biochemistry, the organic molecules that might be coming out of Europa and Enceladus. Water plumes coming out of Europa have since been discovered by the Hubble Space Telescope. So I'm now very excited because we've got an observing program looking at this stuff coming out of Europa and Enceladus, partially inspired by Arthur C. Clarke, who was inspired by the scientific results coming from Voyager. So we've closed the entire loop. We've gone from science to science fiction and back to science again. And I will add, partly also spurred on, not just by the drunken conversation in Hilo, but by the fact that for the last several years I've been teaching a course in physics here called Sun, Stars and Planets, which to an extragalactic astronomer meant I needed to go back and start thinking about stuff in our own solar system again, which is why I spotted the paper about water vapor coming out of Europa rather more rapidly than I would otherwise have done.
Anyone else on that? What do you think might be possible fairly soon that we've dreamed about for decades?
Well, many science fiction writers talk about these little nanobots forming solid surfaces and coming together to do things for us. Frankly, the computer systems that we build in my group right now have the same collective mentality to be able to come together and form things that are greater than themselves. So, for example, what we're shoving out onto water networks at the minute are turning water networks from mere dumb pipes into basically underground robots and so on. And so things that we consider solid and, let's say, solid structures and so on, they can start now with these computer systems to become much more fluid, much more dynamic, and much more adaptable to you and I and the environment around us. And that's the same, let's say, processing ideas, the same computer algorithms and so on, that could be in the smaller form to form these much more, finer grained components.
So who's influencing whom here? I mean, if you go back 100 years and you look at a lot of science fiction, a lot of it has actually come true, or it's pretty close. Now there's various reasons for that. Maybe a lot of people that write science fiction are scientists, or maybe we're not looking at the stuff that hasn't come true. I mean, who's influencing whom here? Or is there no connection whatsoever?
From my perspective.
Well, just generally, how does science fiction influence science, and how does science influence science fiction?
I think it'd be really rare for a scientist to be able to say they have not been influenced in any way by science fiction, because it's just far too prolific at the moment. No matter what, whether you're a reader or whether you just hear stories or whatever. On the other hand, I wonder, it's not proactive. I mean, I would say as a scientist, I would borrow as much from nature as I would from science fiction, and science fiction writers borrow from nature. To me, it's the same spark of an idea. I think the difference is in science, you have to take it further, improve it, and just say it will work mathematically, blah, 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 blah.
We've evolved from a common ancestor.
Exactly, I think so.
Yeah. I mean, some people, they look back at science fiction, and the media in particular, I think, regards good science fiction as stuff that's come true. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's nonsense?
I think good science fiction is the stuff that leaves a footprint in the real world. So Clarke, with Europa and Solidus, that's a good example. William Gibson is another example. Nothing that he's written has come true, but he has shaped language. He talked about cyberspace. He invented the term cyberspace. It's the place where a telephone conversation happens. I think was the way he
It's where you are when you're on the phone.
Yeah. So you might be in London, you might be talking to somebody in Japan.
Where's the conversation happening?
On the phone.
It's in cyberspace. And now, everywhere, we have cyber this, cyber that. We had, last week on the news, we had cyber bombs, we have cyber crime, we have...
Cyberpunks.
Well, we have the queen of cyberpunk here with us today. Yeah, so that's another way that science fiction contributes. It gives us the language to describe the world that we're moving into. And it may not be that cyberspace, as Gibson envisaged it, is not the way cyberspace works today. But it's still the language that he gave us to help us understand that.
In a sense, I don't think that it is the hallmark of good science fiction is whether or not it came true. That's beside the point. In a sense, it's whether or not it sparkles this kind of wider reflections and this kind of words that are self-consistent and compelling, even though they might not have anything to do with any future reality per se. But it's the fact that they're compelling and visionary that matters. And in a sense, whatever comes true.
Science fiction is about the future.
Yeah.
I mean, what else? How is the internet and gaming changing science and science fiction? Is that having an impact?
Well, science has certainly been, we all know that the internet came out of the scientific needs of particle physicists. So in that respect, this is not a good example of science giving you something, the internet, that then snowballed into something much bigger. So, and our practice of scientists has been hugely influenced by the internet and the connectivity that enables building ever bigger teams and being able to work here and in Hawaii and somewhere else at the same time and interconnecting everybody. So in that respect, the internet has changed the way that science, like everything else, works. I'm not sure whether gaming has any particular influence in our field specifically.
I think gaming is, its use for science is at its earliest stages. You've now got, with these massively multiplayer online games, you actually have essentially self-contained communities where you can do some experiments in economics. I don't know how his experiments in economics have worked in Greece. Politically, they didn't go down very well. But Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister for a little while, he got his initial, he came to Greek politics from essentially running the economy of one of the largest massively multiplayer online games, where he could actually try economic models out and see if they worked or not. I suspect that the economic theory and political reality don't mesh very well, which is why he's now back to being a journalist.
Yeah, I would think there's a little more chaos in outside of a game.
Absolutely. There's many more factors you can't control, but...
Actually, to follow from that, a lot of our networking systems essentially are playing games with each other. Each of the components in the network are playing games to try and maximize some value, like the speed of the network or the efficiency of the network, rather than have some single central point saying, this is what you should do, network, which doesn't create a large network, that has problems. We have components of the network working with each other, and they can game with each other to try and max out maybe, I don't know, performance of the system.
But that all goes back to the fundamental, thank goodness, science fictional concept of a massive nuclear war, which is what the internet was built to survive, because it's distributed.
Yeah.
Okay, Pat, can I bring you in here? I'm interested in current sci-fi themes, and one that's been around for a while, which I'm very interested in, is the idea of the fusion of humans and intelligent machines. Could you talk to that at all? What are some of the more interesting themes that, again, may actually have reality attached to them at some point?
Well, actually, I'm not really sure, because I personally don't get behind, the computer that takes over. And to me, if there isn't any real fusion of machine and person, because I think that the person would always override. I mean, you could build and attach a machine annex or something, as like an additional part of your brain so that you could contain more knowledge. But I feel that, it's like the person would predominate. The person would always predominate.
I'm thinking of something a bit more mundane. I'm thinking of things like exoskeletons or, robotic limbs and, and things like that.
In fact, in the novel that I'm working on right now, one of the main characters is a tetraplegic who, and nanotechnology is, it's like super duper, but it won't work on him for some reason. I do a lot of hand waving there. And he has, so in order to move around, he has an exoskeleton. And they keep making better models, and they're, but he lives on Earth, so it's like no matter what kind of exoskeleton he's in, he's still hanging on a hanger. And eventually he feels like, a meat suit full of water balloons, Yeah. And so that's part of it. Now, in a zero-G or microgravity, that would be immensely better, because then it's like you could use the exoskeleton to steer, and you wouldn't have the problem of hanging in it, Okay,
another thing I'm interested in, it's another theme in science fiction, is around, well, there's identity, but also gender seems to be quite a strong theme, and it's similar in hard science to some extent. How, if at all, do you think the gender of the writer influences science fiction? And the same question really with science. I mean, if all scientists were women, would it change science at all?
Well, I think the problem is that if you have all of one gender or all of another, the problem is that you don't have enough diversity. And everybody comes at things differently. We are starting to see the emergence of people who aren't identifying with one gender or the other. They refer to themselves as them or their. And this is an experience, actually, that I don't understand. But just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So it's something that that I'm interested in, because it isn't within my experience. I've felt that right now, the gender roles, if you will, are becoming so much wider that it's not that gender doesn't matter. It's that we have to understand that everybody, regardless of how they identify, brings something unique. So we shouldn't have, it's like all men, all women, all people who don't identify as either one. We need contributions from everybody. And that's what I think is so good. We're not only getting more men and women integrated, but we're also getting the non-Western perspective. We're getting Afrofuturism, We're getting from Asia. There are more people from Asia. Last year, the winner of the best novel, Hugo, was, for the first time ever, in translation Chinese, by a Chinese writer, The Three-Body Problem. It's unlike anything I've read before, and I would advise everyone to read it, not necessarily because it's by a Chinese writer and we've never had that before. I mean, we've had it, but, it's because it's so far out. It's somewhere you've never traveled, and that's the great thing about it.
I can't believe that was 25 minutes. We've got 5 minutes left before we throw over
sorry.
to Q&A. But so maybe one more. No. The whole conversation has suddenly flown by. Maybe one question each. Same question to all of you, which is, if you could pick one thing that exists in science fiction, fantasy, or if you want horror, that you'd like to come true, what would it be? And we'll start with Roberto. Sorry, no warning on that one whatsoever.
Warp drive, or
You want warp drive?
yeah, because it will make the universe
And can you give
accessible.
me can you give me a probability on that in my lifetime?
0. If I have to approximate. but because it will make the universe smaller,
Yeah.
just like the plane made, our Earth smaller, but much bigger scale. So people think, oh, we've gone to the moon. Next is Mars, and next is Alpha Centauri, and next thing is going to be a Farpoint station. No, because the distances are so much bigger in space than we can ever imagine, and therefore, to compress those distances down, there's no known physics that we can use to do that. And so, traveling to the nearest star at the speeds that Apollo 11 reached, which are the highest speeds ever reached in returning from the moon, would take 75,000 years to the nearest star. And once you get there, we're not even sure there's a star system there, so why bother, right? So this, warp drive would be a game changer.
Julie, slightly more time to think about it, but how about you?
Time travel.
Oh, yes.
I'd love to go back and forwards in
Make a
time
smart
and
choice.
try to experience, even just meeting my own family or something like that.
Which actually brings me to H.G. Wells. So I recently found out I went to what is now Imperial College, which
Yes.
I never knew that.
Yes, you did, yes.
Pat, what would you like?
I've been doing a lot of research in quantum mechanics lately, and I would like to know what's going on with quantum entanglement, quantum teleportation, and electron tunneling and things like that, because I think that it's like that holds a lot of. It seems to hold a lot of potential, at least at first glance, for instantaneous at least communication, if not transportation.
Dave, how about you?
Well, I would have said warp drive. I would have said time travel. Quantum weirdness is just a whole family of things. So you've used my answers already. So I'm going to have to plump for something that's not sort of technological. Actual solid evidence for the existence of extraterrestrial life. And I don't mean flying saucers. Microbes on Mars being squirted out of Enceladus or in the upper atmosphere of Venus. I'd be happy with that, because then we know life happened twice, independently, which means it has to be everywhere.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's pretty much our half an hour. We're going to open this up to questions. I'm not entirely sure if we've got microphones or not. You may have to yell. Could you just say if your question is a general one or it's aimed at anyone in particular, in which case, could you say who your question is aimed at? I mean, if you shout reasonably loud, it should be fine. One at the back, you will have to shout quite loudly.
I'm really interested in the virtual reality. So how much of an impact do you think the emergence of virtual reality is going to have both in science and in science fiction as well?
Did everyone get that?
Yep.
The price is going to have to come down a lot before it has an appreciable influence, because right now the Oculus is like, I don't know, 500-700 pounds or something like that, and that's way beyond your end user who can afford an Xbox. So when the price comes down, check with us again.
I would say it's already had an impact, both in terms of science fiction, because people like Pat and many other people have been writing about virtual reality for ages, but also it's had genuine impact in engineering already. Planes at Boeing, the way they do the wiring, internal wiring for the Dreamliner, etc., uses virtual reality goggles to help the people putting the wiring trunks in, to put them in the right place, because they get that projected over where they are working and they put it through. It's been that case, I understand, for quite a number of years already.
I think we had a question. Yeah.
Good science probably asks, what if, or shall we suppose? And certainly good science fiction, I think you said, kind of asks that, what if, let's suppose, could it be that? Is there any difference in the way that you ask that question, depending on whether you're a scientist or whether you're a science fiction writer? The only one who can actually answer that, of course, is Dave, but I'm happy for anyone to answer that.
I'll take a first run at it. When I first start working on a science fictional idea, you go through this process known as world building in science fiction circles, where you have, what if the sky was pink? Just pick that at random. So you then have to build a world where the sky is pink. So rather than having blue as the main colour in paintings by Canaletto, so they'll all be pink. I'm picking an absolutely trivial example. But you have to build a world with your what if that's consistent with that and consistent with everything else. So I conduct thought experiments. Literally, when I'm sort of half asleep, half awake, I will say, well, what if such and such had happened? I'll sort of wander around, kick the tires on that universe. Say, well, if that's true, then what about that? Oh, no, that's not going to work because of the other. And I do approach that almost in an experimental frame of mind, of turning all the knobs, seeing what would happen. Obviously, that's all up here, whereas if I'm doing that in the lab or at an observatory, I'm using chunks of equipment to go and look and see what would happen. So what happens in a distant quasar that might be forming stars very rapidly? Well, how do we find out about that? We go and do observations at these wavelengths at that observatory, etc. So it's a similar frame of mind, but the tools and the end results are quite different.
Anyone else like to pick up on that?
I would say it's a similar frame of mind as well. I think that when a scientist is thinking of their, let's say, their whole career, for example, I'm in computing, so I would look, what would the computers of the future look like? Would I like that? How would that work in the world? That same sort of building a world around it. And then you have to start working backwards to now, because let's face it, if you were to put into funding bodies that futurist thing, they'd think you were crazy. So you have to work back and see what's there today that can give you the first steps to this great, fantastic future that you've kind of envisioned, what you would like to see your subject looking like in 15, 20 years' time, and then start to see what's needed for that, and then start to build the picture up going forward, really.
Anyone else? Or?
No, I think they've covered it pretty well.
Any another question? Oh, so over there.
You alluded to Chinese literature coming into the English language. Most of the publications on science, everything is in English. Is there a provision whereby somebody looks at other languages, perhaps brings it on? Is it the problem with the transliteration, or is it the problem with publishers not being there, or the audience is not aware?
The problem is that translators don't get paid very much. And I mean, that's the truth. We just don't have enough translators to get into, just to see what we're missing. I was at a conference in Russia about 10 years ago, and at this conference there were science fiction writers who had written in Russian, and they were getting life achievement awards, never published in English, And I felt, I felt like I'd been cheated, and I feel like I've been cheated all the time. And so the one thing is to learn languages as fast as you can, or we can find translators. Either we can find the money for them, or we find people willing to work for nothing.
Of course, that does remind me of Douglas Adams and the Babelfish, which is now Google Translate to some extent.
Have you ever tried reading a novel that's been through Google Babelfish?
Give it time. Give it time. Any other comments on that, or another question?
It's kind of a similar question. I'm just wondering, there's a lot of science fiction now emerging from Africa, and I'm just wondering if you know, I haven't been able to read much of it, translation will be one of the problems, but do you know if some of their ideas of the future is divergent to the ideas of development that we currently have? Like, do they think, say, in 50 or 100 years, that they'll be in a position that would be along the same spectrum that the West went along?
Actually, I can answer that from a completely non-science fiction. I mean, if one of the ways that you can engage with the future is through scenario planning, which is used by a lot of large corporates, and there's a real problem with that. Most of the scenario work done is US or it's Anglo-Saxon, and there's absolutely no doubt that there's a US lens, there's a European lens, there's a British lens, and you will see things, you will see the world in a different state. And I've even seen that recently with workshops where, not so much now because things have picked up, but back in the depths of the recession, if you ran workshops in the UK or Europe, they were all sort of dystopian because people were projecting that dystopia forward. But if you did one in Shanghai, there was still this incredible optimism, and that was being projected forward. Anyone comment on that? How did the African science fiction, or to some extent it's the same question as gender, isn't it? Everyone's got a lens. And what I guess science and science fiction needs, as you were saying, Pat, is you need lots of different lenses. That's good.
Like, it reminds me of, I remember meeting someone Russian before Russia became easy to get access to, and asking them about how did the computer develop over in Russia, and being super disappointed that it was exactly the same as the IBM personal computer over this side of that divide, because it had been leaked over the other side, because I got really excited. I wanted to see a completely different design. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, science fiction and science have a quite close relationship, but do you think that literature and art in general, what do you think the relationship with science with just more general art and literature is?
Well, sorry.
Go first.
Well, I mean, there's stuff like the golden mean, I mean, and art has always looked to, at some point, sometimes it seems to me that there's a science to art and an art to science. And I really like that idea, because it means that you are, again, getting a different kind of a lens to look at things. It's like, we talk about equations being elegant, Yes, they are elegant, they're beautiful. I wish I could read them, but I have dyscalculia and dyslexia, but the dyscalculia is worse. We talk about, solutions to problems being elegant. We talk about them in those terms rather than saying, well, that's really efficient, that's accurate, that's precise. But we can also talk about art being precise, in that certain things hit us right in a certain spot. You get moved in a certain way by a picture, a story, a song. So, it's like there's always a lot of crossover, even if we don't realize it. Because I think we're all artists and scientists as called for, And I mean, there are a lot of people who don't realize they're engineers, and they're really good engineers, and they do it elegantly.
Is there a question here?
Yes. Basically, sort of going more into the sociological part of it, Dr. Vincent said that because of the way it's sort of going into the virtual reality, we're becoming not fully absent but not fully present in real world and virtual world. And as well, there's a lot of research done actually in us becoming more and more cyborg-like. We're getting Google contact lenses. We're getting someone's inserted an iPod or something into their arm. How do you feel about that? Sort of looking into the future, do you think it's a worrying development, or?
Well, I've been a cyborg in the sense that I've worn glasses since the age of 4. We've all got, well, actually, fewer and fewer people have got watches these days. But there are iWatches, all the various fitness bands.
I had heart surgery when I was a kid, and I woke up connected to a heart machine or something. I don't know what it was, but it was big, and it was there, and it was ugly. They make them smaller and nicer now.
Dick Cheney was a cyborg. He didn't, while he was vice president, he didn't have a heartbeat. That's physiologically true and artistically true in a different way.
And explains everything.
So he had heart surgery and had a supportive pump that was artificial.
Julie, that sort of strikes me as a question for you with a little bit of Sherry Turkle from MIT thrown in, possibly. Her.
Yeah, no, I mean, as long as it's monitored and the ethics and so on around it are constantly, why not? I mean, why do we need to be just skin and stuff? I mean, look at how wonderful it is that people can go in and get keyhole surgery and get their hips fixed, and when they wear out, they can get them fixed again and again. I mean, that's amazing. We're living longer, so we should have the skeleton and so on bits to let us live longer, you know.
I think on that massively optimistic note, we're out of time. If anyone wants to grab anyone afterwards, I think we'll be milling around. And Dave, in particular, has got some books. I don't know, Roberto, have you got any books?
I do have some.
Roberto has some very good books too, so you need to grab Roberto. Thank you so much for coming. We might try and do this next year, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed for coming. Yep.